This is part two of the lecture for March 24th. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to take you back to our last class in person when I gave you this little handout here. Okay, this is kind of like hard to read, but it's the slope of IS and the slope of LM. Okay, so the advantage of doing a lecture video is that you can put this on pause and go find that piece of paper that I handed out to you. And when you have it again, then return and hit play, and we'll go from there. So the slope of LM is based on the ratio of the change in money demand due to change in income, all divided by the change in money demand due to change in the interest rate. Okay, so this unlocks the story as to the steepness of the LM curve. I didn't include the negative because I just want you to concentrate on the change in money demand due to change in income, change in money demand due to change in interest rate. Okay, the top term is positive in the numerator. The denominator is going to be negative. And then when you multiply by that negative, you wind up with a positive. Okay. So let's ignore the signs and concentrate on absolute value, or in other words, the steepness of this slope. Okay, so the higher the degree of sensitivity of money demand to change in the interest rate, your denominator is going to be bigger, and therefore the slope is going to be smaller. Keynesians argued that money demand was highly sensitive to change in interest rate. Classicals argued it's not sensitive at all. Okay, effectively it's like zero, which would make your LM curve vertical. The monetarists are going to argue that the change in money demand due to change in interest rate is very, very slight. And that would make the LM curve very steep. Okay, so change in money demand due to change in interest rate, very, very small. You have a very tiny denominator. Therefore, the slope of LM is going to be very steep. Okay, now, although there isn't that great controversy involving the change in money demand due to change in income, still though, the more sensitive money demand is to change in income, the greater the steepness of the slope, okay? So keep that in mind, okay? Now, one thing we haven't gone through in detail, or much at all really, is exactly how much the LM curve shifts by. Okay, when there is a change in money supply, or conversely, a change in money demand for some reason. You know, we established which way the LM curve would shift when money supply changes or when money demand changes for factors other than changes in interest rate or income, primarily psychological. For example, people fear the future. Uh, They stock up on their holdings of money at each and every interest rate and income level, right? So that's like an additional variable that's a function of money demand. Since that variable is not on either axis of the LM curve, we draw it, well, then it's a shift parameter, right? And money supply, we know, uh, changes the LM curve or shifts it as well. Exactly how much the shift is and what the shift is equal to, I'm going to save that for a mathematical in-class exercise that I will do for you, put it on the board when I am there with you again on Monday the 29th, okay? So for right now, where your concentration should be is on the steepness of the slope of the LM curve, right? So you got classical saying, hey, it's extremely steep, okay? You got, in fact, they're saying it's perfectly vertical. You have monetarists saying it's extremely steep, okay? So in the classical case, if the IS curve would shift, there's absolutely no change in equilibrium Y in the ISLM model. Okay, if the IS curve shifts in the monetarist perspective, okay, it's going to shift on a near vertical LM curve. Okay, and therefore the change in national income is going to be small, or as the monetarists would say, insignificant. Okay. Now, the monetarists are much like the classicals in terms of what they see, what they portend to occur is not what sometimes happens, what occasionally happens, or even what happens half the time, allowing room for other circumstances where the LM curve isn't so steep. Okay, uh, that's Keynesian. Keynesians are eclectic. Okay, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Okay, monetarists are as fixated on a special circumstance or special case really is what the classicals were. But I drew this for you last class, or the last the last class, the video lecture for March the 22nd. But I drew it a little bit differently. You got different ranges of the IS curve, you got different ranges of the LM curve. From the Keynesian perspective, you could be in a situation where the IS curve is fairly flat and the LM curve is fairly steep. That is a situation or a circumstance or a case that the eclectic Keynesian perspective can explain. Okay? So you could be there. And in those circumstances, probably with interest rates quite high, okay, the LM curve might very well be nearly vertical, and the IS curve might very well be almost flat. Okay, but here's the advantage of the Keynesian perspective. Okay, they're not fixated on just that one circumstance. more often than not, your IS curve's gonna look something like this. So where it intersects the LM curve, um, well, the IS curve is negatively sloped, but not particularly close to being flat and not really close to being near vertical. The LM curve is kind of also like in a medium range there, huh? Not near vertical, not nearly flat. So the Keynesians could explain these circumstances, okay? And if you were like here, okay, if your IS curve intersected the LM curve there, well, both monetary and fiscal policy would be effective. Huh? If we were in a situation like I first had it here, where this is the IS curve, let me draw it a little flatter there. There's your IS curve. Well, in that case, fiscal policy isn't effective at all. Well, that's an overstatement. Is not very effective at all, you could say. It's insignificant, in keeping with how the monetarists would phrase it. Okay, so the monetarists always see this reality. Okay, it's like never deviating. Monetary policy is always significant. Fiscal policy is insignificant. It doesn't have a significant effect on GDP. But look, the Keynesians could also explain a case like this. Case where, hey, the IS curve shifts like maybe it's intersecting the LM curve in this range of the LM curve, and the IS curve is pretty doggone steep. Not not vertical, but maybe close to being there, right? Well, in this circumstance, fiscal policy is very effective and monetary policy would be relatively ineffective, as we said before. So the Keynesian perspective is a general theory. It's a perspective that allows for many different circumstances, uh, different times, different places. The monitor's perspective, they're stuck on this idea that the LM curve is extremely steep, always. Okay, they're stuck on this idea that the IS curve is more or less flat. Okay, not exactly flat, but very, very flat. Okay, and monetary policy is effective. Money is capable of making big changes in national income. Okay, and money is, but fiscal policy is not. Okay, so ISLM, how much the equilibrium changes in the ISLM model, well, that's how much the aggregate demand curve shifts by. Okay, so this fixed rate of growth rule, okay, let's talk about that a little bit. The monetarists propose this fixed rate of growth rule, and I explained why in part one of this lecture video for March the 24th. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about, well, what should this fixed rate of growth rule be exactly? What should determine the rate of growth in the money supply? Well, there's going to be two components. First, what has to be answered is what type of growth rate in real GDP is sustainable over the long haul. By the long haul, I'm not talking, a century-wide perspective or anything, but over the next 5, 10 years, what type of growth rate in real GDP is the economy capable of? Well, let's say, let's say it's decided that that's somewhere, between like 3 and 4%. Okay. Well, your money supply has to grow between 3 and 4% in order to facilitate the exchange transactions that are going to take place in an economy that is growing in real terms at between 3 and 4%. Okay. The next question that has to be answered is what sort of rate of inflation do we want to have? Okay. Do we want 1% inflation? Do we want 2% inflation? Or maybe 3% inflation? Now keep in mind that we're not going to choose, no one is going to choose a target rate of inflation of 0%. That would be treading very dangerously close to popping into deflation, which is disastrous from a macroeconomic perspective, as we've talked about before. Okay, we want a positive growth rate in prices. We want positive inflation, maybe 1%, maybe 2%. The monetarists would incorporate that into this fixed rate of growth rule, right? So, what type of growth rate in real GDP is the macroeconomy capable of? Okay, if it's 3%, write down 3%, right? If you want 1% inflation, and if you feel 1% inflation is enough to accommodate or help relative prices adjust, which we've also previously spoken about, well, you add the 1% to 3%. Well, okay, have money grow at 4%. That accommodates a 3% growth rate in real GDP and accommodates a 1% inflation rate. Okay. If, on the other hand, we think the real economy is capable of 4% growth, and we still want the 1% inflation, if that's the target rate of inflation, well, then the money supply should grow at 5%. Okay. If we want a little higher inflation, well, then 2%, let's say, well, then you add the 2% inflation rate to the 4% real rate of growth in GDP, and you grow the money supply at exactly 6%. Okay, that's your fixed rate of growth rule. But whatever the central bank, the Federal Reserve, comes up with, okay, they should stick to this fixed rate of growth rule. Okay, hold the wheel steady if the economy comes upon a bumpy ride. Right? There's a problem with inflation, still stick to that fixed rate of growth rule. if inflation is running a little higher, stick to the fixed rate of growth rule. Okay, it'll come back down is the idea. Huh? Little ups and downs because of minor insignificant things happening in the macroeconomy. Stick to your fixed rate of growth rule. You're going to smooth out the ride. If there's a bump and we're encountering a bit of a recession, still you stick to the fixed rate of growth rule. Okay. Now, the monetarists also want the Federal Reserve or any nation's central bank to announce what this fixed rate of growth rule is. Okay, so the Federal Reserve or any nation's central bank would let it be known what the growth rate in money stock is going to be over a prescribed period of time, and then they're going to stick to it. That will smooth out the ups and downs of the macroeconomy. That's the secret to macroeconomic stabilization for monetarists. Okay, so this is Milton Friedman's point of view. This is his school of thought. Uh, Milton Friedman, by the way, a few more words about him. Milton Friedman was a student of Friedrich von Hayek, also known as one of those, free market economists. Friedman was his student. They both wound up being professors at the University of Chicago. And it is with such people in mind that today we speak of the Chicago School of Economics. Okay, so there's the Chicago School associated with the monetarism of Milton Friedman, but there's also this notion of the Chicago School associated with free markets in general, a type of libertarian perspective. Just as the case is, though, with Milton Friedman, a lot of people that latch on to Hayek, okay, Friedrich von Hayek, as some sort of free market hero, conveniently neglect to mention a lot of things that they were actually for, that in the context of today, I don't know if we would associate it with most of the people who, particularly in the United States, think of themselves as true-blooded conservatives or something. Hayek, like Friedman, um, did not have a problem with social insurance. Didn't have a problem with constraints on business to protect the environment. Again, so long as the same rules apply to all businesses in all industries. If you're going to tell this business and this industry not to pollute, you got to tell all businesses in all industries the same thing. They would say that, okay? But they were not opposed to the use of government power to safeguard the environment. They were also not opposed to social insurance, things like health insurance for all, provided by or government making sure that all citizens or all people residing within that country have it. Okay, um, so Milton Friedman, known as a conservative economist, free market type, libertarian, okay, also non-interventionist in terms of macroeconomics. Okay, he did not favor discretionary fiscal policy being used. Okay, it wasn't going to be effective. Okay, if you use it to fight a recession, you're going to run up a deficit. Okay, government should have a balanced budget. Okay, he did not favor discretionary monetary policy because it's doomed to make mistakes for the reasons I spoke about previously. The central banks are going to get the magnitude of the correct adaptation in the money supply or rate of growth in the money supply wrong. They're also going to get the timing wrong. Okay, so there is this on the part of monetarists, this perspective of non-intervention. Leave it alone. Instead, follow a fixed rate of growth rule in the nation's money supply and stick to that rule. Okay. So, in the short run, monetarists agree with Keynesians that the aggregate supply curve has positive slope. Okay. Um, that's in the short run. We'll talk about the long term later, I believe on Monday, March the 29th. Okay. I'm going to have something a little bit different for you to watch for Friday's lecture. Okay, which I'll be sending to you in a couple days. Okay, but for right now, we've introduced monetarism. We've said what it meant in terms of their view about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand doesn't change significantly as a result of fiscal policy or other variables that shift the IS curve, huh? Okay. Only money matters significantly. Okay. And monetarists, that's kind of close to the classical position. Okay. It's not saying it in such an extreme way as the classicals did, but it's fairly close to the classical position. Okay, so anyway, that concludes our lecture today.